Hi there, it's Keith from the Evangelical Free Church, Stony Stratford, and we're continuing our series of short talks in the Ten Commandments. And today we come to the fifth commandment, Deuteronomy 5 verse 16. Honour your father and your mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live long and it may go well with you in the land the Lord your God is giving you. First thing to note is that there's a shift now in the focus of the commandments. You may have noticed that the first four are all about our relationship with God. Now it starts to turn its attention to how we relate to each other. Some years ago, a book came out with a very telling title. It was called Families and How to Survive Them. It was written by Robin Skinner, who was a psychologist, and by John Cleves, the comedian. Well, whatever else the book had to say, it tells us that there can be issues with living in a family. But the Bible always paints a very positive picture of family life. Children are seen as a blessing. So we really need to work out the context of this commandment. And perhaps the best place to go and do that is to look at the New Testament. In Paul's letter to the Ephesian church, in Ephesians 6 verse 3, he notes that this is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with them when they get into the land that God had promised them. Why? Well, we learn by seeing, don't we? And if children saw their parents treating their grandparents well, their parents well, then that's a good example. It's a good thing, isn't it? An example to give them in how they will treat their parents in their old age. People learned by example, and in extended families at the time, that was particularly poignant. But there's another thing here. The word honour is the Hebrew word, which is very similar to the Hebrew word for worship. It's not saying we worship our parents like we do God, but it's saying we should respect them. And lastly, the Lord had actually commanded it. He had commanded it, but he had given a benefit if people observed that command. It would go well with them in the land that they were going to. But how is this to be practiced? Families are not easy things for some people, are they? And we have to be realistic about that. Well, the first thing to note is even in a topsy-turvy world, everyone has a father and a mother. And a family unit that is stable is one that will engender respect in the children. I often thought, if I can't respect my parents, then why would I respect anyone else? There's a real issue there. But with that comes a responsibility. And again, we go to the New Testament to see this in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 21. We see that after verse 20, I'll just read verse 20 because it's poignant. Again, it repeats the command. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. In one version, it has exasperate your children. I know a chap who was at my home church, the church I grew up in, and he became a Christian in his 40s, I think it was. And he said until he actually became a Christian, he thought it was his job to exasperate his children. He thought that's what parents did. But he learnt better. No, parents are to set an example. They are to set an example of fairness. They are not to make demands on their children that are unreasonable. They are to bring them up with kindness. Tracy and I have never had children, But I look to the Bible because I think it's a good guide. And I also think it's a good guide because my parents were Christians. And I had the privilege of being brought up in a Christian home. My dad was a very wise and sensible man, and a very humble man. And he once told me that he felt that he'd done better with me than my two brothers who were older. He was humble to admit that sometimes perhaps he'd been a bit harsh or he'd overreacted. I respected him for that. But I think that raises something which is interesting, and Brian Edwards, who has written an excellent book on the Ten Commandments, has an interesting take on it. And it is just because the home is the hardest place to maintain constant respect for each other that God places the marker here. This value and respect should begin in the home, because it is the hardest place to maintain consistency. In the home, we are at our most vulnerable. It's a high marker, but for children and for parents, we are to act with respect for each other, because actually that is what God commands. Thank you so much for listening.